One of the two basic insights that allow us, I think, to make some progress when we're thinking about public policy is that public policy is not generally made until the very end in the visible political process. Once upon a time, public policy was taught in political science departments, and it was taught through looking at the activities of legislatures, high-level political institutions like the cabinet and so on. But the modern study of public policy is always, I think, organised around some version of what we call the policy community idea. And that is, I think, a very straightforward idea about insiders and outsiders. The policy community consists of policy insiders, and beyond the policy community and interacting with the policy community in interesting ways are outsiders. So this policy community, we now understand, first of all, is organised around issue areas. So we would talk about the energy policy community, or the social policy community, or the health policy community. So immediately we've got away from thinking of the political system as this large whole, this large kind of body, and we've organised our thinking about the way policy is made around these issue areas. The way the issue area works is largely governed by the perceptions of the insiders about what constitutes health and not health, or what constitutes social and not social, or what constitutes energy and not energy. They're not interested in the not energy problems. They're interested in what they themselves see as a result of shared language, shared professional norms, shared interactions, all of these kinds of things that forms the community, a shared understanding of these are the key questions facing us in Canada or Australia or Latin America or wherever it may be. These are the key questions that constitute the policy agenda for energy policy or social policy or health policy. And it's that sense of a group of people who are who share these assumptions that form the community that allow us, I think, to make progress in understanding how a policy agenda is made, what kind of options are likely to appear when governments start to think about formulating policy, the likelihood of a particular decision being made one way or the other, and the likely chances of policy actually being implemented as a result of government capacity, but also as a result of stakeholder buy-in to the policy that's ultimately made. So it's a key insight that is expressed in a whole series of different ways: policy communities, policy networks, policy insiders. I've used that idea, stakeholders. That there are a group of people who matter, and there are a group of people who are on the fringes of mattering, if you like, and there are a group of people who are not paying attention at all. A very large group of people, the majority of citizens in a country, who may actually never pay attention to a particular policy area, or whose attention may be fleeting if there's some crisis or some event in which an element of this policy area suddenly is kind of put before people as mattering. So I would guess most people in Canada thought nothing about transportation policy, but a huge accident like Lac-Mégantic or something like that, which showed the failure of policy, draws it to their attention, and for a while they do start to ask questions about why is oil being transported in trucks? What's the regulations governing the design of those trucks? What is the oversight of the companies that are operating those trucks? The sort of technical questions that the insider communities, they know the answers to those by heart, and they know the discussion around why they should be this and not that, or whether they should be this and not that, but is really of no concern to people outside the community unless there's a crisis of that kind.
In some ways, one has to answer the question in a quintessentially Canadian way. in the networks and communities are sort of the counterpoint to the stylized Weberian view of public administration, which is that it's a hierarchy, that it has a tight boundary, that there's a flow of power up and down, and that it's self-contained, and in that sense it fits very much in the rational actor model, where policy problems are puzzles that can be uniquely solved. And in that world, you can put a bunch of policy wonks in a room and they'll solve the problem, right? That modernist enterprise of building a professional inside group started in the British parliamentary world, and Saskatchewan was one of the centers of that movement to build a professional policy analysis, policy management space. But as we solved the low-hanging fruit problems, the easy problems, and as we built things, once we built them, then the complexity of what we built became more obvious. And at that point, then we realized that the public space, although it's large as a percentage of our total space, it arguably represents 35 to 55% of our national economic activity on an annualized basis. Their fingers touch it, and it motivates and guides much of the rest of our economy and life through regulation and other policy directives. It still isn't in charge. Individuals are well motivated. Firms have great capacity. They're not isolated in little atomistic actors anymore. They're global enterprises with broad competencies and capacities that are in-house, that challenge and sometimes dwarf the capacity within the public space to frame out problems and look at issues. And so as governments started to, as they built this modern enterprise of a hierarchically driven, rational process, they sort of hit diminishing returns. And at that point, we as scholars and practitioners said, hey, we don't have all the answers. We're not even sure we even know what all the questions are. We better start talking to people. And so the doors started to open, and they opened as they built industrial conversations, as they built community level and socially defined conversational spaces. We encouraged and supported and sometimes financed the emergence of a whole new civil society that's between the individual and between the state. And it's some people call it the meso level. It's the place where people connect. We don't connect to states, really. I mean, we vote once every 4 years, and then we complain watching the national news every day. That's hardly connection. But we do belong to interest groups, unions, professional associations, churches, you name it. We're socially densely connected to our business, our pleasures, our social space. That's the networks and communities that the policy literature talks about. That it's not just, because if we don't have that space, then the state has a lot of power against any individual, because no individual counts. But when you get these meso-level structures emerging, they could be large corporations. That's the one that worries people. But in many cases, most of the really important policy questions can only be understood and answered by talking to these large meso groups. If you want to talk about healthcare, you got to talk to unions, patient advocacy groups, nurses, doctors, health economists, policy practitioners who don't work in government. And so if government just wanted to manage the policy system for health, and they did it internally, they'd either have to grow massively, or they'd have little or no capacity to understand the underlying problems of the system. And so that's the challenge. And every policy space is like that now. We have this meso level of people that are interconnected. They're projecting values, they're projecting interests, and they're projecting an epistemic set of norms and principle-based approaches. And those are critical parts to understanding how to refine our policy system and refine our governance system. Because otherwise it's a really blunt instrument. If the government tries to do it all for us, they usually make mistakes. It's when they understand the nuances. And so in the first instance, the policy system opened up, but the government still delivered the goods and services that the policy system moderated and defined. Now we're discovering that the government's even a blunt instrument in terms of delivery. And so we're moving away, across most OECD countries, we moved away from governments owning and controlling the means of production. So crowns are still dominant in some parts of economy and society, but overall, the role of the state owning telcos, utilities, and other things is shrinking. The government role in private industry and manufacturing and resource development is a lot lower than it was 25, 30 years ago, because we said we just can't manage it all. We don't have the capacity. The government is no more efficient and effective, in most cases was less efficient and effective at managing than people who are motivated by profit rather than some different mix. In the rest of the policy space, we used to assume government was responsible for the social, health, economic development type activities, and it was centralized within executive government, and there was a hard boundary. But increasingly we've discovered that sometimes the systems have difficulty recruiting and motivating people to work in those spaces. But more importantly, government is not the dominant or even best advisor and player in some of these policy areas. You need to work with people who are closer to the clients, closer to the citizens we're trying to assist. So in immigration policy, it used to be a government venture. Now they use groups like Open Door Society and others as partners, and they're not for profits. They're that third sector. They're mesosector. They're actually the clients who are self-managing. The customers, the citizens that the programs are intended for, are managing their own delivery, and you're seeing that right across the piece. You're seeing we're shifting away from telling you how to run your business from health, safety, and environmental risk perspectives to saying, here's the outcomes we want you to achieve. We want this emissions below this level. We want accidents below this level. We want safety at this level. We don't care. We're not going to tell you how to do that. That's your job as companies or as industries. And so you're starting to see a much more densely engaged space. The state is unambiguously part of it because they control the hammer in a lot of these policy areas, but the state isn't the dominant player anymore. And the challenge from a scholarly academic perspective is that historically we taught the cognate fields for interdisciplinary public policy in narrow departmental space. So you were trained as an economist, or you're trained as a political science, you're trained as a sociologist, trained as an anthropologist. There's nothing wrong with that, but increasingly we realized that no one of those disciplines was an adequate preparation and had a large enough toolkit to assist people to really help in the framing and implementation of policy in this more networked world. And so that's where the emergence of public policy schools came from.